Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. Sometime after the scandal broke about writer Cormac McCarthy, I happened to see some posts on Facebook by Rebecca Solnit that I thought I would read to you. They are public posts. Now, she indicates that some of this material comes from her book, Recollections of My Non-Existence, but other of this material comes from online. So this was November 22nd on Facebook. The whole Cormac McCarthy grooms an abused 16-year-old girl and then steals her stories and voice for his books thing has really bothered me and a lot of other women. A bit more on that subject from the internet and from my memoir, Recollections of My Non-Existence, about Muse as trap. I wrote, as a reader, I roamed free. As a would-be writer, it was more complicated. In my teens and well into my 20s, I mostly encountered the literature of heterosexual men, where the muse or the beloved or the city they explored or the nature they conquered was a woman. Throughout my teens, I wrestled with Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which seemed to have something valuable about trees and alphabets I could never quite extract from its erudite jumble. It's a book that seemed to assume that the poet's orientation is that of a straight man to a female goddess. It might have encouraged some young women to smile enigmatically and levy tribute, but I wanted to be a writer, not a muse. I should say that I have tried to read the prose of Robert Graves. I have some volumes somewhere and have never been able much to get into it. I also struggled secretly against the men around me who were convinced that they were the artists and I was the audience. Young women like me were supposed to exist as orbital figures, planets around a sun, moons around a planet, never stars. When I was 18, one man was so adamant that I was his muse that he inspired in me a vivid sense that I was literally standing atop a pillar. I can still summon up a sense of being stranded in the hazy, grayish atmosphere of nowhere. On a pillar, there's nothing to do but stand still or fall. I was happy to listen and read, but I was mutely against being only a listener and reader, though all I could do about that was bide my time and build my work. So that sounds like a pretty awful spot to be in. Having to be somebody's muse. I got something most women got, an experience of staring at women across a distance or being in worlds in which they barely existed, from Moby Dick to Lord of the Rings. Being so often required to be someone else can stretch thin the sense of self. You should be yourself some of the time. You should be with people who are like you, who are facing what you're facing, who dream your dreams and fight your battles, who recognize you. And then other times, you should be like people unlike yourself, because there is a problem as well with those who spend too little time being anyone else. It stunts the imagination in which empathy takes root, that empathy that is a capacity to shapeshift and roam out of your soul self. One of the convenient afflictions of power is a lack of this imaginative extension. For many men, it begins in early childhood, with almost exclusively being read and given stories with male protagonists. To be a young woman is to face your own annihilation in innumerable ways, or to flee it, or the knowledge of it, or all these things at once. The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, said Edgar Allan Poe, who must not have imagined it from the perspective of women who prefer to live. I was trying not to be the subject of someone else's poetry and not to get killed. I was trying to find a poetics of my own with no maps, no guides, not much to go on. They might have been out there, but I hadn't located them yet. The struggle to find a poetry in which your survival rather than your defeat is celebrated, perhaps to find your own voice, to insist upon that, or at least to find a way to survive amidst an ethos that relishes your erasures and failures, is work that many and perhaps most young women have to do. In those early years, I did not do it particularly well or clearly, but I did it ferociously. That last part bothered me. The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, said Edgar Allan Poe. Thinking of M.I. Finley's statement that hindsight is not a joke at the historian's expense, the same might be said. Hindsight is not a joke at the poet's expense. And I think there was no need to drag Edgar Allan Poe into the story. The point was that this writer, Cormac McCarthy, had used this young woman as something of a muse or to supply incidents in his fiction. Edgar Allan Poe had a bit of a troubled existence. I don't think he would be classified by anyone as a paragon, and we are fortunate that he left us a smattering of brilliant poems, and some of his poems, Eulalume and Lorelei or something like that, reveal pretty plainly how off to one side or off kilter he was or could be. But I, of course, would not take away points of any poet for his or her failures. He gave us The Raven, of course, The Bells, and innumerable stories, and so forth. So there is no reason when he is talking about literary creation that he should be imagining some person somewhere else. And if you are going to denigrate a writer taking inspiration from a real person, then why don't you pick the best and take down Dante, for example? I believe Beatrice was a similar muse, and she also died. I think that came across in the comedy and so forth. It's harder to denigrate Dante than it is Poe, or to make a cheap joke at his expense. Now, I've talked about my relationship with the muse, and when I say the muse or the muses, I am using the word in, I guess, the Greek sense. I am not talking about a specific person. If you get behind the scenes and you read one of my poems and I talk about you, or I talk about she, you will know that there is a truth behind that word. But my muses, there's about a handful of folks that occupied that space at one time or another, and when I am writing, I can use them for this or that characteristic. But as a person who, well, to use Keats's phrase, has passed that nebulous state in between the imagination of a boy and the imagination of a grown man, I have come across to the other side. I understand that there is a distinction between real people out in the world and literary inspiration. The old poets, such as Dante or Petrarch, I think were pretty clear about it, that this beloved lady was a contrivance. Now, if other people have not been clear, that's their own fault, but it's to be expected somewhat. It takes a while to sort things out. The business of one's life, to use Blake's phrase, can become just to pluck out the heads of the darts, but it need not go in that direction. In her book, Recollections of My Nonexistence, which is a catchy title, she actually talks about how somebody told her a story about a young girl who had her braids cut off, and she was writing an essay at the time, and she just took this other woman's story and put it in as the ending to her story. Fiction writers do this kind of thing all the time. One of the things Cormac McCarthy was criticized about was something like he used the name of this young woman's, or this woman's by that time, this woman's dog or horse or something, and he used that as a name for a dog or a horse in one of his stories. That kind of thing is pretty de rigueur in fiction writing. When I was a kid, I wrote a short story, my first one, about being a detective. I was really enthused about writing a detective story. And I asked my grandmother to read it, and she was horrified. She got real mad because one of the characters was the name, well, I used her maiden name for one of the characters. She just got really mad about that. I was just groping around for a name, and that one happened to be a name that I had heard, and so I used that. I never really would have thought that it would bother somebody like that. I mean, of course, then we all went about our day. I'm just trying to see. Well, the book falls open to the part where Mr. Young told me men had come by and asked which apartment I lived in, which of course he didn't tell them, but it fed my nervousness. In the book, she talks about how I think it was her first apartment. Turns out it was in a black neighborhood, and she's proud of the fact that she was the first white person in 17 years to have moved into the building. And Mr. Young, the black manager, she lets you know his race, kind of looked after her a little bit. So she was real happy that he did not tell these folks which apartment she lived in. Now, she doesn't say if these guys who were coming around to asking which apartment she lived in, she doesn't mention if they were black, but we know Mr. Young was. I'm just looking for things in here, and unfortunately, I did not. Oh, here's the part where she talks about that. James Young was the building manager's name. I always called him Mr. Young. Sometime or other, he mentioned that I was the first white person to live in the building in 17 years. The other residents were mostly older. Well, I mean, it's neither here nor there. She also lived kind of not a too long distance from the Castro neighborhood, so she got to hang out with gay men and lesbian women. There's an interesting anecdote in here where she's out to a party and her boyfriend or somebody does not show up to pick her up. When we exited into a very black night, I somehow found myself talking. Oh no, that's not the one. Darn it, where is it? Well, at any rate, the whole point of the story was oh, I found it finally, sorry. I was on the main thoroughfare between two houses. I realized that someone was behind me. I turned around. It was a big man with a shaggy beard and long hair. I walked faster. He was only a couple of feet behind me. So she's getting stalked. And it goes on. Then a guy drives by in a car. He leaned over to open the passenger door and offered me a ride. The stalker murmured from very close behind, "Don't you know that getting into a stranger's car is the most dangerous thing you can do?" Of course, I had been told that over and over, and I hesitated. Then I got in. The driver said, "I passed you once and thought that it was none of my business. Then I thought it looked like a Hitchcock movie, so I came back. I'm grateful a man rescued me from a man. I wish I had not been in a Hitchcock movie where I needed rescue." I think that speaks to the heart of the situation that this woman who is writing about Cormac McCarthy found herself in. She was surrounded by men of unsavory character or disposition, and so she sought out McCarthy to be a man to save her from a man. That's a pretty common event in the ways of the world. I tend people. She has an article up at Vanity Fair, and I could not make it through the whole thing. It was pretty awful, but she vetted this writer and really wanted him to be the writer, and people think it's pretty poorly done. And my feeling was that she simply had bad taste in writers. Let's see if there's anything else in here. Well, that one that I read almost, I somehow found myself talking about my own this is when we exited into a very black night. I somehow found myself talking about my own early struggles with publishing. It had been a long time since I'd recalled how bitter my early endeavors to put out books were in their own small way, or rather how fervently men had sought to prevent me from publishing. I was lucky in that I overcame the obstacles they erected, but I presume others did not. I don't understand that sentence exactly. I was lucky in that I overcame the obstacles they erected, but I presume others did not. And now I can see how white the world of publishing was and is, and that though some doors slammed because of my gender, others remained open because of my race. So it's something of a feature, I think, of some feminist writings to try to align one's experience to the Black experience. And let me see if I can find the place where she does so more explicitly. Yeah, I didn't need that part. I'm sorry that I just can't find anything in here. I thought that having a vague idea of where things were, I would be able to do it. The term double consciousness is sometimes used for Black experience in a white culture. W.E.B. Du Bois famously wrote in the last years of the 19th century, and wrote, as so many men did up through at least James Baldwin, as though all people were men or even one man. Quote, "The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil, and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others," unquote. Perhaps there should be another term for never looking through the eyes of others, for something less conscious than even single consciousness would convey. Du Bois's framework found an echo in John Berger's 1968 Ways of Seeing, when Berger imagined with generosity and brilliance what it was to be something he had never been. To be born a woman has to be born within an allotted and confined space into the keeping of men. The social presence of women has developed as a result of their ingenuity in living under such tutelage with such a limited space. But this has been at the cost of a woman's self being split into two. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continuously accompanied by her own image of herself. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does, because how she appears to others, and ultimately how she appears to men, is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. Her own sense of being in herself is supplanted by a sense of being appreciated as herself by another. You depend on men and what they think of you. Learn to constantly check yourself in the mirror to see how you look to men. You perform for them, and this theatrical anxiety forms or deforms or stops altogether what you do and say and sometimes think. You learn to think of what you are in terms of what they want, and addressing their want becomes so ingrained in you that you lose sight of what you want, and sometimes you vanish to yourself in the art of appearing to and for others. So that brought to mind a little bit, and I don't think I marked out a place for it, but to Esther Vilar in her book, the manipulated man, in which she says basically the same exact thing applies for men. That men tailor all of their behaviors for the approval of women. Once again, I didn't mark anything here. A series of training exercises are built into man's life, beginning at a very early age. It is fortunate for woman that the male infant is under her close jurisdiction, as it is easiest to train him then. And by the natural process of selection, the very women who are best suited to training men are the ones who reproduce themselves. The others are incapable of reproducing themselves anyway. She's always a little bit snide, Vilar is. The mere fact that a man is accustomed from his earliest years to have women around, to find their presence normal, their absence abnormal, tends to make him dependent on women in later life. But this dependency would not be serious, for a life without women would in that case mean nothing more than a change of scenery, just as someone born in the mountains might go and live in the plains. And although he might long nostalgically for his mountain home, he is unlikely to go back. Other things become more important in his life. It would hardly be in the best interests of women if they only inspired in men a vague romantic nostalgia felt only on Sundays or when away from home, having no direct consequences. She takes care that man is directly trained for a particular purpose. He must work and put the fruits of his labor at her disposal. Woman has had this aim in view throughout the upbringing of her child, and she engenders in him a series of conditioned reflexes which cause him to produce everything to satisfy her material needs, and so forth. I think the material conditions of life have changed in our time. She's writing from the 70s, but certainly the role foisted upon men that a man should protect a woman from other men or another man, that remains constant. That is still very much there. It's a role that many of us would not, I guess, sign up for without some sort of recompense. It's hard to thrust oneself in danger, and I can think of times when it has happened, interceding, for example, on behalf of some young woman being accosted at the Dunkin' Donuts, that kind of thing. You put yourself at risk. Was there anything else here? Well, I'll just see what I have here. The economic hegemony of the United States influences not just the politics, science, research, and culture of all other capitalist countries, but to a great extent, the social behavior of their populations. Through the mass media, which have been relentlessly perfected, this influence spreads to all areas of life more and more rapidly. The old maxim about American consciousness becoming the consciousness of the world after a 5-year lag no longer holds true. Modern techniques of communication have flooded over the boundaries separating place and time. ... As soon as the American female compares her situation with that of American blacks, women in England, France, and Scandinavia scream, "We are the blacks of the nation." This is a revised edition, by the way. The original edition did not correct the word "we are the blacks of the nation." A different word was used instead of the word blacks. These are the reasons why yet another women's liberation movement has failed. The enemies they fought were really friends, and the real enemy remained undetected. Once again, the fixed idea of sexual solidarity, under the circumstances a solidarity with a syndicate at best, misled women to the wrong strategy, and they were not aware of it. Their struggle was aided almost exclusively by men. But since they live under the delusion that they are persecuted by men, they mistook the flexibility of men for a sign of female strength and screamed that much louder. And nobody got offended. From the New York Times to the Christian Science Monitor, from Playboy to Newsweek, from Kissinger to McGovern, everybody was for women's liberation. No marches of men were organized against them. Nobody prevented their demonstrations, and none of them were taken to task for their unending defamation of men. As Senator Joe McCarthy oppressing women's liberation was missing, the FBI did not lift a finger against them. Just as their predecessors, the suffragettes, secured the right to vote for women within a short period, a right they left unused by not electing women to political power and by not stopping war, women's liberation saw most of their demands fulfilled immediately. The outrageous inequities in the law had, after all, been established by men for women's protection. But the ladies themselves did not see it that way, and when they insisted on change, within months they succeeded, and so forth. And that is one of the uncomfortable truths about how human society is set up. As a writer of poetry, I have taken you behind the scenes occasionally to see the unsavory truths behind what we write, and one of those is this creation and implantation in the mind of a reader, this ideal of a woman. Because inherently, there exists no reason for a man to prefer one woman to another or to restrict himself to one woman as opposed to others. And I mean, there is no inherent distinguishing feature of a woman unless it's something external to her personality, such as if she's younger. So a woman who is younger has that attribute working for her in a physical sense. The role, or one of the roles, of the poet is to suggest other possibilities. Unfortunately, it is a technique or technology which gets out of hand sometimes. So this idea, I mean, both Vilar and Solnit, where did I put Solnit, are talking about, one says man and one says woman, are being trained to please the person of the opposite gender or the opposite sex. And to some degree, in either case, I think that is just implicit upon becoming an adult. The idea of not 100% resorting to one's own personal desires of the moment. I mean, that applies equally to men and women. No one has propriety on that concept. So it's in both men and women, and particularly under the marriage contract, it is a form of yoga, we might say, a yoking, a restraint. It does not always work out that well. I'll just read a little bit from Before Night Falls. One day, my mother and I were on our way to visit one of my aunts. As we walked down to the river, a man came toward us. He was good-looking, tall, and dark. My mother fell into a sudden rage. She began picking up stones from the riverbank and throwing them at his head, while the man, in spite of the shower of rocks, kept coming toward us. When he was close to me, he put his hand into his pocket, pulled out 2 pesos, and gave them to me. He then patted me on the head and ran away to avoid being hit by one of the stones. My mother cried all the way to my aunt's house, where I found out that the man was my father. I never saw him again, nor the 2 pesos. My aunt asked my mother to lend them to her, and I do not know if she ever paid them back. My mother was a fallen woman, as they used to say. It would have been difficult for her to find another husband. Marriage was for virgins, and she had been seduced. If any man approached her, it was, as common wisdom had it in those days, to take advantage of her. My mother, therefore, had to be very mistrustful. We went to dances together. She always took me along, although I was then only about 4 years old. If a man asked her to dance, I would wait on a bench. Once the dance was over, my mother would come and sit next to me again. If someone invited her to have a beer, she dragged me along. I did not drink beer, but my mother's suitor had to buy me many rayados, which is what we in the country called ice grated with a plain and flavored with colored fruit syrup. Perhaps my mother thought that at one of those dances she would find a dependable man who might marry her. She did not find him, or did not want to. I think my mother was always faithful to my father's infidelity and chose chastity, a bitter chastity, unnatural and cruel, because she was then only 20 years old. My mother's chastity was worse than that of a virgin, because she had known the pleasures of love for a few months and then gave all of it up for the rest of her life. This created in her a great sense of frustration. So these systems that have been set up, unfortunately, have their instances of collateral damage. For some people, it works splendidly, splendiferously. For many people, it's an uncomfortable fit, and some people are just ejected. Let me see. Thinking about taboos, I'll read a little bit from Jomo Kenyatta. I should say what this starts with. In this book, Arenas talks about his childhood, his sex-filled childhood. So everybody in the village was doing it with animals and so forth, chickens, hens, dogs, what have you. And he talks about his uncle riding him to town, and while he was on the saddle, his uncle's member would grow hard, and he would eventually ejaculate, and then they'd do their business in town, and then they would take the long ride home, and the same thing would happen. Today we would call that as sexual abuse. He does not use that terminology, and I don't know if it would have been described as such then, but it certainly was what happened then. And so Kenyatta here talks about traditional sexual taboos. Between members of the, and I have to point out that none of these taboos have to be. These are all things that have been created by human beings via religion, via poetry, that kind of thing. They are all cultural artifice. Between members of the same family, all forms of erotic connection are considered a great sin. Although there is great freedom among young people in their courtship and amorous experiments, brothers and sisters would not dare to indulge in these activities in one another's presence. In bachelor huts where young people meet freely, brother and sister cannot be present together at the same time, except on purely social occasions when there is no sex play. He talks about this thing called ombani na nweko. I'm not sure how to pronounce that exactly, that the Gikuyu participated in, which was a form of sex play amongst children. For example, if a brother knows that his sister has a lover in a particular bachelor hut, he makes a point of not visiting the hut during the times when she is frequenting it. The same thing applies to the sister. This rule is also observed in dances and other ceremonies. I should say the sexual activity that goes on between young folks is given some sort of supervision by adults, and there are prohibitions. I believe in some cases there is to be no sexual intercourse or penetration, I guess would be the word, but in some cases intracrural coitus is allowed. Would that be the way you would say it? I don't know the words, but the boy placing his member between the legs of the girl, I think. No brother could take his sister or any close female relative as a partner on such occasions. During festival dances, where people from various districts meet and dance together, it is not always possible to recognize a relative who comes from far away, and a man may sometimes be seen dancing with his cousin by mistake. When this happens, people who know will start laughing and joking to warn the young man of his error. At once, the two separate and find other partners, and sometimes a present is given to the girl by way of apology from the man. I mean, I remember a close friend of mine when I was young wound up having a complete sexual encounter with his first cousin, and it was something that just sort of happened, and I think accidents do happen, as we say, but nevertheless, society depends upon there being these strictures of prohibition. All sexual familiarity between parents and their children is strictly forbidden. This applies to all children of the members of one's own age grade, and breach of this rule is considered a great crime. This, of course, does not restrict parents from teaching their children about sex. During early childhood, parents talk freely to their children, explaining all matters connected with sexual taboos. In the Gikuyu community, any form of sexual intercourse other than the natural form between men and women acting in a normal way is out of the question. It is considered taboo even to have sexual intercourse with a woman in any position except the regular one, face to face. I think we allow for a lot more than that. And I think a lot of cultures allow for a lot more than that. Before initiation, it is considered right and proper for boys to practice masturbation as a preparation for their future sexual activities. Sometimes 2 or more boys compete in this to see which can show himself more active than the rest. This practice takes place outside the homestead, under a tree or bush where the boys are not visible to their elders. It is considered an indecency to be seen doing it, except by boys of the same age grade. The practice is given up after the initiation ceremony, and anyone seen doing it after that would be looked upon as clinging to a babyish habit and be laughed at, because owing to the free sex play which is permitted among young people, there is now no need to indulge in it. Masturbation among girls is considered wrong, and if a girl is seen by her mother even so much as touching that part of her body, she is at once told that she is doing wrong. It may be said that this, among other reasons, is probably the motive for trimming the clitoris, to prevent girls from developing sexual feelings around that point. Owing to these restrictions, the practice of homosexuality is unknown among the Gikuyu. The freedom of intercourse allowed between young people of opposite sex makes it unnecessary and encourages them to acquire experience which will be useful in married life. I should point out, when he talks about initiation, he is talking about what is commonly called circumcision, but which is really genital mutilation. And the genital mutilation done on the females can be significantly more extensive than that which is done on the boys. In either case, I oppose it, but I have always admired the greater freedom of sexual contact among the children. I, of course, would let there be a lot more things open to people. So I think this notion that the man and woman can only do it the normal way, face to face, well, I think other positions seem perfectly allowable, and the practice of homosexuality is unknown. Well, I bet it still happened off there somewhere, and I am a product of my generation and think that it is perfectly fine. So there we go with that. And I was going to say something else, but now I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh yeah, that reminded me of the thing that I read by John Stuart Mill in a recent video. He's talking about his father. In ethics, his moral feelings were energetic and rigid on all points which he deemed important to human well-being, while he was supremely indifferent in opinion, though his indifference did not show itself in personal conduct, to all those doctrines of the common morality, which he thought had no foundation but in asceticism and priestcraft. He looked forward, for example, to a considerable increase of freedom in the relations between the sexes, though without pretending to define exactly what would be or ought to be the precise conditions of that freedom. This opinion was connected in him with no sensuality, either of a theoretical or of a practical kind. He anticipated, on the contrary, as one of the beneficial effects of increased freedom, that the imagination would no longer dwell upon the physical relation and its adjuncts and swell this into one of the principal objects of life, a perversion of the imagination and feelings, which he regarded as one of the deepest seated and most pervading evils in the human mind. And that's where our restrictions, both for boys and girls, both for men and women, are such that all are exposed then to greater manipulation. All of our advertising is playing into that. And I would consider that while society must enforce some form of prohibition, yet it probably should have the broadest possible leeway. So I would not suggest, for example, that the prohibition against carnality with animals be taken away, or with members of one's own household, and so forth. Saying that, people being people, I mentioned that friend of mine and his cousin. Moving on to the Old South, this book points out a cardinal tenet of the ideology of domesticity and what made it attractive to so many white middle-class women held that women were morally superior to men. Finding themselves increasingly superfluous in the world of economic production and excluded from a public voice, middle-class women discovered in the notion of moral superiority not only a source of self-esteem, but also a means of affecting the world at large, albeit from the sidelines. By setting women up as an example of Christian piety and virtuous conduct, the proponents of the ideology of domesticity offered the 19th century woman the opportunity to believe herself capable of exerting influence over her husband and children. A beacon of morality in a world run amok, her very existence embodied the Christian ideal, and women could at least hope that their piety and purity would have an elevating effect on male callousness and brutality. And somewhere I have here Moses Finley in his brilliant, this is an article included in Aspects of Antiquity, his brilliant one about the silent women of Rome. He talks a little bit about early Christianity. Where Christianity differed most radically from many, though not all, of the other mystery religions of the time was in its extension of the central idea of purification and purity beyond chastity to celibacy. For many women, this attitude offered release through sublimation. That the traditional pagan world failed to understand or even to believe this was possible is comprehensible enough. The Roman aristocracy had long been suspicious of the various new cults. A great wave of orgiastic Dionysiac religion had spread in Italy after the wars with Hannibal, soon to be suppressed by the Senate in 186 BC. Even Isis worship had a long struggle with the state before achieving official recognition. Anyone who reads the hymns or the detailed accounts of the cult in Apuleius or Plutarch may well find that hard to understand, but the fact is that Isis, though she attracted all classes, was particularly popular in the demi mode. And so forth. Even without taking it that step into celibacy, chastity may be hard enough. And I think I didn't bring it out, but my book, The Soul's Refinement, I think I attributed a lot of the strictures on us in the West to St. Augustine, but I haven't read St. Augustine, so I don't know. But I know very well Paul's dictum, better to marry than to burn. So he felt that one should marry to have release for those sexual urges within a restricted sphere. Of course, I think nowadays there is no reason to restrict ourselves that much. I don't think that there is to be much good to come of that. But thinking historically, let me see if I can. I'm going to read a little bit from Tommy Curry's The Man Not. He is, I believe, a professor in Edinburgh, and he discusses the problems or the vicissitudes, let us say, involving black masculinity. Now let's see what I can find here. He mentions, if you've read any of the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, you remember there is this scene with his overseer or whatever, Covey, is it James Covey? And Edward Covey, and he determines that he is not going to take it. So Curry writes a little bit about this. The rush of Covey to strip Douglass naked, the tiger-like fierceness of tearing his clothes, Covey's wearing out of his switches on Douglass's body, the eagerness that Covey displays in this first whipping after telling Douglass to strip naked. What does this mean to our imagination when our thinking is turned to the sexual violence of an enslaved man? For years, thinkers have pointed to the sexual implications and homoeroticism present within the conditions of slavery. In reality, the rape of enslaved men, just like the rape of enslaved women, was used as a routinely present technology of racial domination. Should I say that again? Yeah. In reality, the rape of enslaved men, just like the rape of enslaved women, was used as a routinely present technology of racial domination. I'm going to read about 2 pages from Curry's book here. During slavery, the sexual coercion of black men and boys was conditioned by white sexual desire for black bodies and white puritanical repulsion toward blackness, sex itself. Nowhere is this as poignant as in the case of white women raping enslaved black men. The call to undertake serious study of white women's brutality against enslaved black women was first made in Sabine Broke's Property, White Gender and Slavery. But few have pursued this line of inquiry regarding black males. Foster, and I think I wrote the name down, Thomas Foster. Foster argues that the traditional denial of white women's sexual agency has contributed to our obscured view of those white women who sexually assaulted and exploited enslaved men. The dominant narrative of slavery makes white men the heterosexual culprits of sexual assault against black women. However, little or no literature considers the rape of enslaved men and boys by white women. Within the present heteronormative account of rape during slavery, the white woman is erased. She is made into an inactive bystander. In reality, white women were active participants in the rape and sexual abuse of black men and boys. As Foster notes, all white women could coerce enslaved black men given the legal and social setting in which they lived. The rape of enslaved black men was not about physical strength. And then there's a long quotation from Foster. Women who may have been physically smaller and weaker than their victims still wielded a powerful threat. Wives and daughters of planters who formed these sexual relationships were simply taking advantage of their position within the slave system. Having sex with their white counterparts in the insular world of the white planter class, if exposed, would certainly have risked opprobrium, and even gossip about their public actions might have marred their reputations. Daughters of planters could use enslaved men in domestic settings, however, and retain their virtue and maintain the appearance of passionlessness and virginity while seeking sexual experimentation. In other words, one of the ways that some Southern women may have protected their public virtue was by clandestine relations with black men. So that ends the quote by Foster. Now back to Curry. The coercive force white women wielded over black males during slavery is considered in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Commenting on the predatory logic of white planters' daughters, Jacob writes, "They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves." Jacobs recounts that she saw the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. His daughter deliberately targeted the most abused and broken enslaved black male. As Jacobs writes, she did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. It is often suggested that white women were too weak, too feminine to overpower the black male brute. But such responses deny the vulnerability enslaved males within slavery and in its aftermath. The ever-looming threat of death as punishment for offending the social order empowered white women to act and coerce black males as they pleased. Of course, my interjection here is we don't need any more Emmett Tills. And I think if that means that we have to, instead of imputing some form of deviance to the boy, acknowledge his accuser's tacit or unacknowledged pedophilia, then we should do that. Of course, the mob listened to the woman and took care of any potential problem like that, and she lived a long and life free from conscience, I guess. Sorry, let me continue. Under the cloak of white femininity woven by her actions and claims of vulnerability throughout history, the white woman raped the black male. The historicity of the white woman exceeds what is traditionally thought of as her confinement to womanhood, that she is a rapist, that she reduced him to his phallus and executed him as her rapist when her transgressions were discovered, that she used her confinement to virtue as the guise for her violence against black men and boys, that she raped them for pleasure and to satisfy her need for power over the black male, and that her conquering of the mandingo, the undifferentiated phallic flesh of the enslaved male, excited her and created the mystique of womanhood. All of this is unknown. This rape of black males by white women is denied by theory, since theory founded on the anthropology of the white European Western man aims to protect the innocence of the white woman from the horrors her presence has committed within history. The mystique of the feminine is defined by her unimaginable sexual past, the deniability of a sexuality that could spoil her virtue. Instead of exposing this deployment of power, sex, and racial violence, contemporary feminism, even black feminism, has allowed rape to be understood primarily as heteronormative violence that originates from the male and is perpetrated against the female. Because it is founded on the mythology of white gender relations, this ahistorical account allows women as a notion to remain inculpable for the activity of rape. So we're talking about rape in its modern definition, which does not restrict itself to the penetration of somebody. One of the uses of having read this book after having read The History by Henry Adams was that Wills decides to go into some of the prurient details which gentlemanly Henry Adams preferred to leave untouched. So, talking about now what? Well, let me just start. What is Randolph's first name? Adams wrote a biography of Randolph. We have a street in Chicago, Randolph Street. He was very important. John Randolph. Yeah, I think it must be John Randolph. Henry Adams's grandmother had written that Randolph was to Congress what Shakespeare's fools were to a court. He kept Congress awake with his quips and cranks. Randolph will be a tormented but truth-telling jester in the history of Henry Adams. The fact that the book is not vindictive can be readily established. If Adams merely wanted to punish Randolph, he could have used material he explicitly renounced, though he knew it well. That material concerned a family scandal to which Randolph reacted with a mad vengefulness and the physical malady that exposed him to ridicule. The scandal could not be omitted in more recent, less Victorian biographies, since it involved the whole Virginia establishment: John Marshall, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson and his daughter, and much of the thickly ramifying Randolph connection. The story is lurid. It's lurid, but it's just what people do. It has been called the greatest scandal that ever touched the proud Randolph family and Virginia's most famous 18th century criminal proceeding. First, the scandal. On October 1, 1792, when John Randolph was 19, his beloved older brother Richard was accused of a sexual affair with his beautiful sister-in-law and cousin, Nancy Randolph. He apparently covered up Nancy's miscarriage and disposed of the evidence of it. Richard Randolph, with the help of a stellar team of lawyers, John Marshall, Patrick Henry, Alexander Campbell, got the charges dismissed, though Jefferson's daughter, Martha, a friend of Nancy, said that the public did not accept the whitewash. John Marshall's biographer says that he may not have had any other case that required quite as adroit and persuasive an interpretation of the known facts. So far, the scandal had not touched John Randolph, though he gave misleading information to defend his brother at the hearing. But he disgraced himself horribly 2 decades later. He convinced himself that Nancy had not only ruined but ended his brother's life. He died 3 years after the scandal. Now he set out to destroy her and her marriage to Gouverneur Morris, the revolutionary financier of New York. Morris had wed Nancy in 1809 after asking John Marshall if there was anything he should fear from the old scandal. Marshall answered no. When Richard's son visited Morris's home, the thought of his brother's offspring under Nancy's roof drove Randolph into a frenzy. He sent a long letter to Nancy addressed to Morris with instructions that he read it before delivering it to her. The letter claimed that Nancy secretly buried her illegitimate child since it had a black father, her slave Billy Ellis, though she told Richard that the father was his brother Theodoric, who died conveniently 8 months before the birth. After burying and killing the baby, she got Richard to hide it in a woodpile out of pity for her, and she repaid him 3 years later by poisoning him. Randolph warns Morris that she may be planning to poison him. She is a vampire that, after sucking the best blood of my race, has flitted off to the north and stuck her harpy fangs into an infirm old man. Adams says in the biography that Randolph was unhinged at times. That is evident from many things Randolph said and did. Adams did not have to adduce this episode to prove it. But his only reference to the scandal and Randolph's response to it is this. Richard's last years had been embittered by a strange and terrible scandal resulting in a family feud, which John, with his usual vehemence, made his own. These complications would have been trying to any man, but to one of his peculiar temper, they were a source of infinite depression and despair. Of course, we know very well all of the depredations of white men upon black women, and we are beginning to know the depredations of white men upon black men within the context of American slavery. But it is only through these rare scholars such as Tommy Curry that further aspects of the truth are coming out. And there is a perfect case of where I think this long ingrained prohibition proved inconsequential or more problematic than anything. You know, the problem, what was Lincoln's thing? Just because I don't think that I want a black woman to be my slave does not mean I want to have her for my wife. And the folks in the South and North, I suppose, were all upset about this idea of miscegenation. But there was so much of it going on. I mean, it was ubiquitous, pretty much. And I just think that if white, you know, this goes to that quote in my The Soul's Refinement, which I'm not going to pull for you, but I read it, where James Baldwin said that for the, I'll link the video in which I talked about it, for the white, now I can't think of how it went. That the white man, the white person has to be freed within his mind from these weird ideals, particularly those pertaining to the innate chastity or whatever of white women, white men to a degree, that sort of thing. And if white women and white men would like to have sex with black women and black men, or whatever combination you like, I think it would be best all round for white people just to acknowledge that. And this idea particularly that white women are a breed apart that have no innate sexual yearnings and desires really ought to be discarded. I mean, I don't know that I should read you north to south, but it's another case of the colonial system. And I knew a woman who was she loved being a white tourist in Africa. I hear you have traveled abroad, I say. Yes, Hassan replies. My girlfriend took me with her. Who was your girlfriend? She was a lady from Switzerland. Did you ask her to take you abroad with her? No. Did you ask her to take you abroad with her? No, she invited me. What did she say to you? She said she liked me. She said she was lonely and wanted me to be her friend and companion. Her husband had just died and she had a lot of money from him. Did you think it strange? No, many Mzungus offer to take beach boys like myself home with them. I have had many invitations. How old was your girlfriend? Hassan hesitates. The question embarrasses him. Was she much older than you? Much. How much? She was 50 years old. How did you meet her? As I meet all the other Mzungus. They come, they ask for a guide. If they pick me, I take them around and show them what there is to be seen. Most of them, though, do not only want a guide. What do they want? I'm sure you can guess. Germans are the worst. And you give them what they want? Why not? They pay me well. Men too? Yes, men too. Hassan smiles. It is all the same to me, men or women. Tell me more about your girlfriend from Switzerland. She was not a human being. Very few Mzungus are human beings. Why do you say that? Because of the way they treat us. How do they treat you? Like animals. Most of them only want one thing from us. Why, then, did you go abroad with your Swiss girlfriend? Because I wanted to see the world, and she was giving me the opportunity. Because I didn't think she would be like all the rest who wanted to take me with them. Again, Hassan hesitates. She said she wanted to adopt me. Well, I can leave it there, but I think you can see, I mean, the behavior of men has been long scandalous, but under the slavery system, under the colonial system, it has its counterpart with the female of the species. And as they say, the female of the species can be more deadly than the male, to quote Rudyard Kipling. Emmett Till sure found that out. I mean, I don't think, within the course of my life, there has been a sea change in how we look at things. When I first read Thomas Jefferson, I was real young. He was a book that I took to Taiwan, and I read Lincoln, and I loved Lincoln, and I read Jefferson, and I tried hard to read it, and I read some of it. And I remember being so naive about Jefferson and the whole setup of American slavery. And of course, now we know so much more than that. And now, so we have sort of lifted back the veil on the male part in the, say, the plantation system, the colonial system. But I think now we are seeing the female role becoming exposed, which I think it is a good thing that more of this comes out. This notion, how was it phrased, that a cardinal tenet of the ideology of domesticity and what made it attractive to so many white middle-class women held that women were morally superior to men. I think we know by now that this is a false construct. I think that's probably enough to say. I wasn't quite sure where I was going with this. The thing, I guess, I pulled out my Garcia Lorca, but I have the other one somewhere. It's a translation. There's, I thought I had, there's a very nice New Direction volume. Oh, here it is. You know, thinking about, oh, and I should say, well, when it comes down to Shiva Naipaul, he died young, unfortunately. He has a really magnificent book out about the Jonestown massacre in Guyana. It's really a masterful book discussing that. This book, it's a bit episodic. So is the Solnit memoir. It's a bit of a memoir, but it's all over the place. So I wouldn't particularly recommend either of those. But I was thinking in lines of some of the frustrations of his mother, of the poems by Federico Garcia Lorca. And well, there's Thamar and Amnon, which talks about a different forbidden kind of love. I think it's the story of a brother and sister. But the one that I am thinking of is the La Casada Infiel. Well, I'll read you the translation. This is translated by Stephen Spender and J.L. Gilly, I guess. The faithless wife. So I took her to the river, believing she was a maiden. But she already had a husband. It was on St. James's night, and almost as if I was obliged to. The lanterns went out, and the crickets lighted up. In the farthest street corners, I touched her sleeping breasts, and they opened to me suddenly like spikes of hyacinth. The starch of her petticoat sounded in my ears like a piece of silk rent by 10 knives. Without silver light on their foliage, the trees had grown larger, and a horizon of dogs barked very far from the river. Past the blackberries, the reeds, and the hawthorn, underneath her cluster of hair, I made a hollow in the earth. I took off my tie. She took off her dress. I, my belt with the revolver. She, her 4 bodices. Nor nard, nor mother of pearl have skin so fine, nor does glass with silver shine with such brilliance. Her thighs slipped away from me like startled fish, half full of fire, half full of cold. That night I ran on the best of roads, mounted on a knacker mare, without bridle or stirrups. As a man, I won't repeat the things she said to me. The light of understanding has made me most discreet. Smeared with sand and kisses, I took her away from the river. The swords of the lilies battled with the air. I behaved like what I am, like a proper gypsy. I gave her a large sewing basket of straw-colored satin, and I did not fall in love, for although she had a husband, she told me she was a maiden when I took her to the river. Particularly that book, the Romancero Gitano, what is it? Well, I don't think it, yeah, well, I think that's it. This is a very good bilingual selected, New Directions. But let's see. In the Spanish, it's Romancero Gitano, yeah. So I'm not sure what the translation of that is, gypsy romance or something like that. And so I mean, this all ties back. I mean, I thought it was a bit of a rude joke against Edgar Allan Poe to bring him into the mix of the prurient scandals of Cormac McCarthy and the umbrage and outrage felt by many persons at his having enacted the role which apparently the woman or young woman sought from him. But I think while you have all of these little eddies and whatnot amongst the minor poets, when you have a major poet like Dante, you have a much more sharp focus. And that is why I say that it is harder to excuse Solnit for condemning Poe in her ironic way. She ought to man up, so to speak, and take down Dante if that's what you want to do. You know, if you want to take down this idea of a poet being inspired by a young woman who dies early, then take down Dante, please. From the topic of poets, though, I always I love all of these little eddies, these poets that are not, I think I wrote that in one of the poems, I prefer the cackle of the barnyard fowl to the sound of the eagle soaring overhead, or whatever it is. It's in one of my sonnets, the first book of sonnets. And so that's why when it comes to a poet like Abu Nuwas, I like his poetry insofar as I've gotten my hands on it. And I used in my book Songs of the Nights, which are poems derived from the Arabian Nights, I used also one poem from him. He features as a character in the Arabian Nights. And poets, like in the case of the Garcia Lorca book, he touches upon all kinds of sexual situations, or romantic situations, if you will, situations of love, carnal and otherwise. And when he talks about the brother and sister, it is not to say that he is condoning anything. I, as a poet, believe that everything is open to us. There's a booktuber who fancies himself a bit of a writing instructor upon occasion, and a lot of his advice will be to his young acolytes that they should restrict their vocabulary. So there was a poem which was, what was the one? The Fury of Aerial Bombardment, where the poet should not have used the word, gosh, what was it now? Multitudinous. That word does not belong in a poem. And I, as a poet, I take the opposite tack. I say absolutely every word under the sun is available to me. Every word in English and every word outside of English. I think if one is writing for a newspaper or something, then restrictions upon one's vocabulary make perfect sense. So one will say, do not use the word ponder. That's a bad word for the newspaper readership, given that the newspapers are aimed at, what is it, a third grade level, reading level or something like that. But when it comes to poetry and the art, there are no words off limits to us. Even incarnadine, to use one from Shakespeare. Well, I won't go into Shakespeare. But I also think that there is no subject that is off limits to us. And so I will close out with a reading of a poem, which is a loose translation from Abu Nuwas, in which he is watching a rape take place. So I call it a riff on Abu Nuwas. Among the revelers, after the binge, I spotted one awakening. He stole up to the novice while the household whole lingered asleep so that he might infringe. With something viper-like, snake predatory, he pierced him, leaving wounds beyond accord. Prized open butt cheeks with the edge of sword, and pummeled as if in a quest for glory. He leaned upon his victim and bent over, maintaining silence, with his eyes cast down. No holding back, I cried, but drive to town. Mercy can wait till after you recover. Squeeze his balls gently, he likes it all right. Long times he's wanted screwing to be manned. If he were sleeping, his cock wouldn't stand. Look how he holds his legs together tight. So there's a bit of obscene writing just to close out the prurient theme of some of this video, although I think the subject is a serious one. And so I advocate more openness, more open discussion, and so forth. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.